The book I'm going to discuss now is called The World After Gaza by Pankaj Mishra. Those of you who heard my talk on Hamid Tabashi's book less than 48 hours ago will have perhaps a few insights into what I might be talking about today. I did mention Pankaj Mishra's book when I talked about Tabashi's work. And there is, of course, I think, a significant overlap between these two books. Both of them are works that are sensitive, erudite, and both of them display what we can describe as some kind of outrage about what has happened in Gaza. Now, none of that is really new. And I've already spoken about what I think is distinct in Hamid Dabashi's work and his interpretation of the implications of what has happened in Gaza. Let me now turn to Pankaj Mishra. Pankaj Mishra is, of course, a well known public intellectual. And this book is, in fact, a collection, I think, I haven't gone to check, but a collection really of some of the essays that he had written on Gaza, Palestine, and the implications of what's happening for the New York Review of Books. And I think that this book is a work that really collects these essays. And that might be the weakness of the work, because in some ways, these 6 essays are very learned, they're erudite, they're very readable, unquestionably very readable. But it's not clear that they're really connected in what I would call a really coherent fashion. There is an argument. And so, what he has done in this work is he has divided it into 3 parts, as can be seen over here. Part 1 is the afterlives of the Shoah, that is the Holocaust. And that long chapter is called Israel and the Incurable Offense. And essentially, it looks at what's been happening in Gaza, and it looks at really not just what's been happening in Gaza, because it's not fundamentally a narrative about the day-to-day events, of course. I mean, there's very little of that. What it's really about is it's about the creation of the state of Israel, the kind of commentary that we have had on the state of Israel by intellectuals, the relationship between Israel and much of the world over a period of time, the nature of Zionism, right? It's about all of that. And in some sense, it's a bit rambling, you could say. Part 2 is called Remembering to Remember the Shoah. I think that title is significant. Remembering to remember that people didn't just remember the Shoah just like that. There was an attempt, a concerted attempt to make Holocaust memory part of the imagination of the world. And here again, the argument is not entirely novel to Pankaj Mishra, because, for example, Peter Novak, who is mentioned in this book, wrote a book called The Holocaust in American Life, where one of the things he argues with great effect is that for the first 2 decades after the Holocaust, there was barely any mention of the Holocaust in the United States. And it's singularly important that perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most well-known commentators and writers on the Holocaust, a man who was a Holocaust survivor himself. I'm referring, of course, to the essayist and the novelist and the writer, the public intellectual, Primo Levi. That Primo Levi had to struggle to find American publishers of his books. At least that's what Pankaj Mishra says. I know that I have in my library a paperback edition of one of his books on Auschwitz, which was published, I think, before Pankaj Mishra says that any book of Primo Levi's was published in the United States, but nevertheless, it is true. We know from biographies of Primo Levi that he had to really struggle to find publishers of his books. And it wasn't really until, let's say, post 1965, about 2 decades after the end of the war, that you begin to see the Holocaust become a part of public discourse in the United States. And of course, we're talking about the United States principally here, in addition to Israel, because the United States is or pretends to be the principal guardian of the memory of the Holocaust, in addition to, of course, Germany, right? And so the two chapters in this part two, Remembering to Remember the Shoah, are indeed on Germany. The chapter is called Germany from Anti-Semitism to Philo-Semitism. How is it that this German who absolutely loathed the Jew and who had to exterminate all the Jews, how did this German become the lover of Jews, right? Philo-Semitism, right? And then the second chapter of part two is Americanizing the Holocaust, how the Holocaust and its memory, all of this came into the American domain. Part three is called Across the Color Line. 2 chapters, The Clashing Narratives of the Shoah, Slavery, and Colonialism, where what Pankaj Mishra seeks to do is to, in fact, try to bring in the interconnected histories of racism, slavery, colonialism, right, into play in a consideration of the Shoah. Right? And the last chapter, Atrocity, Hucksterism, and Identity Politics, how the Holocaust has been sold and why it is that there is what we might describe a convoluted kind of politics of identity around the idea of the Holocaust, right? So that's the structure of this book. Let me take, I hope, no more than 20 minutes or so to discuss some of the features of this work. I've already indicated it is a work that's learned, erudite, elegantly written. Mishra has always been a good writer. And there are some new insights. I wouldn't say there's philosophical depth in this book, but if there's a book that you really want to read, which will astonish you because of the kinds of sources that he draws upon, I've said twice before, it's learned. And they're quotations from over 100 writers. And there are 150 references in the bibliography in the book, further reading. At the same time, the book is not of much use to scholars, certainly. Of course, that's not really my principal concern. And these talks that I'm giving are not talks that are intended really for scholars as such, although I hope that they will also benefit from them, right? But the book does lack what is considered to be the elementary paraphernalia of any book of this kind. There's no index and there are no notes. So he quotes a huge number of writers, and often you don't know the source of that quote. You don't know if it's accurate, right? I suspect that they are accurate. One of the things to do, of course, is you can put in some of these quotes into Google and then find out for yourself. And of course, there are many of these quotes that I've encountered before, so I can verify to the authenticity of these quotations that he has. But nevertheless, the point is that there are no references, citations. There are. When I said the references at the back, what I meant really was a reading list. He has a reading list at the end, or a select bibliography. Although many of the works that are mentioned in the book in itself are not mentioned in the bibliography. So you can take this bibliography as further reading, right? So there are these criticisms. The more heftier criticism is where are the Palestinian voices in this. Right? The very few, very few. There's an occasional nod to one or two poets. Mahmoud Darwish's name comes up, as it does in almost every book having to do with Palestine, but there are no Palestinian voices. And in that respect, we could say that the title of the book itself, The World After Gaza, it's not really the world, right? What you're really hearing about is Europe, in particular Germany. There are certainly some other writers who are mentioned, who are not German, who are not American, and who are not British. Primo Levi, for example, Jean Amory is mentioned. So there are a number of other writers, European, who are mentioned. But if we're thinking about, for example, what people in Japan or Korea or China or anywhere in Latin America might be thinking about what's happening in Gaza, or what implications the conflict, the war, the genocide in Gaza has for any other part of the world outside Europe and America, if you're anticipating that there may be something of that because the book is called The World After Gaza, it's not there. And there again, we come to the brutal recognition that in this work, as in nearly every other work, when people refer to the world, what they're really referring to is the United States and Europe. And that's all that seems to matter. And because this is a book about Gaza and it's a book about Israel and what Israel has done in Gaza, and it's about the Palestinians, therefore, perforce, there is some mention, of course, of the Middle East. There's mention of Nasser, right? Because one of the things that the author does is he really looks at, in a fragmentary way, and some aspects of the history of the warring between Israel and the Middle East. And we know that Nasser was part of that history. And Nasser was very often maligned, particularly by the Israelis, by people such as Ben-Gurion, as another Hitler, which is, of course, absurd. And this is what we should always remember. And here, I must say that Pankaj Mishra is faithful to the point that I'm trying to make, and that I've made before often in my work, and certainly I did it in my talk day before yesterday on the Hamid Dabashi book, After Savagery. And that point, namely, is that Israel is a problem that was created by Europe. It's like many other problems that were created by Europe and subsequently picked up by the United States, and the United States then becomes the greatest carrier of those problems. Right? Racism is a problem that really is invented by the Europeans. Yes, I know that people will tell me that, some people will tell me that there's a history that goes back to 2,500 years, but there are different ways of speaking about racism when we speak about scientific racism. The attempt to, in fact, establish racism on a scientific basis, okay, then we're really speaking about something that transpired in Europe in the 18th century. There's just no question about that. Right? And this is one reason why James Baldwin said that your racism began in the minds of white men, and it can only come to an end in the minds of white men. Right? Now, this book has something to say about that as well. So I've not brought in that quotation randomly. James Baldwin is one of the African American intellectuals, one of the Western intellectuals who figures in this book. Right? But let's take a few of the let me take a few of the nuggets from this book, just to give you a scope of an idea of the scope of this work, and recall what I said, that there are some insights to be drawn from this work. Okay, these insights are not always developed. That's another critique that I would have of Pankaj Mishra's book, that um, he recognized, for example, that there's no history of anti-Semitism in the East, in countries such as India and China. But he drops it. He completely drops it. He just mentions it. He doesn't really try to follow through on what that might tell us, not about just India and China, what it might tell us about the West, right? He does not develop the insight about the feminization of the victims of the Shoah, something that was engaged in by the Jews themselves. So if you turn to, for example, page 95, right? The he's he says the Israeli Irish writer Ronit Lenton remembers in her book Israel and the Daughters of the Shoah, published in 2000, how she was trained to despise diaspora Jews for having gone passively to their death. Jewish diaspora life was seen, she writes, as doomed to destruction, and Zionism as the only answer to the plight of the Jewish people. All right. So there's a very interesting literature, of course, on this whole question, because the picture that has long been drawn is that the Jews went passively to their death. And I have to say that, I mean, notwithstanding attempts to try to contest this, the fact remains that a very substantial number of scholars of the Holocaust, even when they are aware of the various forms of resistance that were encountered in the camps, have nonetheless concluded, rightly so, that on the whole, we have to agree with the picture that was drawn earlier. That is, that you have a mass number of Jewish people who went passively to their deaths. And to say that is not to deny, of course, the history of such things as the Rosenstrasse demonstration or the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Okay, but to go back to this quote, because we need to pick up on the point that I talked about, the feminization of the victims of the Shoah. Okay, right? Israel, she recalls, was a place where Jews would be proud again, would take up arms to fight their enemies. It would never again go to their deaths like lambs to the slaughter. The Shoah's victims, says Pankaj Mishra, were feminized in contradistinction to the image of the Israeli Sabra, depicted as a young male soldier with blonde hair and blue eyes fighting for his country like Paul Newman in Exodus. This is the film of 1916. Right? And of course, this is exactly, as Pankaj Mishra points out, right? This is exactly what you find in India, where the militant Hindu nationalists and the RSS, right? They are going to try to now basically raise the image of the Hindu male as someone who was really heroic, muscular, who stood up to the depredations of the Muslim, and this was in part a reaction to a long history of the colonial effeminization of the Hindu male. And that's why Pankaj Mishra says immediately at the end of the passage that I just read, many Zionists, like Hindu nationalists, had internalized a racist arraignment from Christian Europeans that their co-religionists were cowards and weaklings. Right? And this is, by the way, a way for me to also interject another point here, that when I said that, the word really here means Europe and America for Pankaj Mishra when he's speaking about Gaza and its implications. Well, there's obviously one other country that he brings into the discussion, but he does so only because that's a country that he hails from. where he originates from, and that's India. And so that there sporadically he'll talk about what it was like growing up in India, what kind of image he as an Indian had of Israel, and some of this resonated with me. He and I are roughly around the same age group. I think he's maybe a few years younger. And yeah, I remember doing a school project where one of the things I did in that project, so it was really like a scrapbook. So I had pasted a photograph of Moshe Dayan, right? So this a heroic Israeli general, the architect of Israeli victories, with a patch on one eye, right? And his image was in some ways splashed all over. And so Pankaj Mishra is recalling that. He's recalling what he was growing up with. And so there is a discussion of India every now and then, including how India's relations with Israel have changed over a period of time. Because, as some of you will certainly be aware, India was a country that did not have diplomatic relations with Israel for several decades. And Israel was a staunch supporter of the Palestinians. I had gone to Ramallah about 10 years ago. I'd gone to Israel. I went to the West Bank as well because in my trips to Israel, I always made certain that I went to the West Bank as well. And so about 10 years ago, I'd gone to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and I went to the West Bank. I went to Ramallah, and I went to the Mahmoud Darwish Museum, where there is a small display of Indira Gandhi receiving Mahmoud Darwish, right? So relations were quite close, and India was a staunch supporter of Palestine. India was one of the countries that voted not to accept the partition plan, right, in 1948, and India was one of the countries that supported a resolution that was introduced in the General Assembly describing Zionism as a form of racism. Right? And then everything changed. And we know, of course, that today India is one of the staunchest supporters of the state of Israel, right? With close defense ties and so on. All right. What other insights does Pankaj Mishra have? So he talks about things that many of us are who've been reading about Palestine and reading about Palestine not just in the newspapers, but reading something more substantive than what the newspapers have to say, right? And what have we been reading about? We've been reading about, of course, the genocide that has been perpetrated there. He talks about he talks a little bit about the war. He talks about some of the obscenities. Some of you might remember, for example, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, some of the soldiers of the IDF dancing with the lingerie of Palestinian women. Because this was supposed to suggest, oh, everybody says, look how they're suffering, and yet these women are still wearing this lingerie, right? I mean, really, absurdity, frankly. Not that they had lingerie, but what the IDF soldiers were, cheap, right? A cheap kind of display of voyeurism as well, all right? So he talks a little bit about these kinds of things. He talks about the ethnic cleansing in the opening pages that has made Israel largely, Gaza largely uninhabitable. And he goes over some of the history of Zionism. But are readers aware of the fact that people like David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel, if the founding ideologue was in some ways Herzl, the founding father, the principal political figure in the first few decades of the history of Israel is, of course, David Ben-Gurion. How many people are aware of the fact that David Ben-Gurion had contempt for the victims of the Shoah? Sounds totally unlikely, isn't it? Israel is a state that was created for the victims of the Holocaust. It was created as a state that would for once and for all give the Jewish people a home and a security. And Israel was sworn to give that security. And that's partly what Pankaj Mishra is saying explains the savagery of Israel, or at least that's the excuse they can muster up. That if there's anyone who thinks they can get away with perpetrating atrocities against the Jewish people, well, let them learn a lesson that this is totally delusional. We are going to smash you. We are going to crush you, right? All of that. That's the logic. Okay. Now, nevertheless, what he says is that there was a widespread disdain, both among some of the Zionist leadership and among ordinary Jews who had survived for other Jews, including those Jews who didn't survive. So for example, Polish Jews were seen as particularly dirty, degraded by, for example, a Czech Jew, right? I mean, it seems very unlikely, doesn't it? Right? But what Mishra is saying, and this of course has been talked about in different ways in different works that have been written on the Holocaust. We know that Hannah Arendt was slammed by many Zionists because one of the things she pointed to, Primo Levi, the survivor who I've already mentioned, one of the greatest writers on the Holocaust, and a number of his books has obviously talked about the capo, talked about the Jewish middlemen, if I may put it this way, right? In the camps, who were delegated with the responsibility of beating other Jews and basically doing some of the dirty work for the SS. And of course, Primo Levi ultimately says that we have no moral authority. He's absolutely right to pass judgment on them. I mean, if you were living there, you had to use your wits. You had to exercise your own judgment, however flawed a moral judgment it may seem today, right? You had to exercise your judgment about all that you were prepared to do in order to survive. But what Mishra is talking about when he is giving these quotations is he's not talking about, people having to undertake certain acts because they had to survive. He's talking about the contempt that many Jewish people had for other Jewish people, for some of the survivors. Right? And he's not doing this out of any anti-Semitism whatsoever. Once again, we have to be very clear about that. He's simply saying that there's a whole conundrum of problems here that we have to think about. And so, for example, just so that I can give you the quotation, so this is from page 35 of this book, okay? Right? Seeing Zionism as a rejection of the diaspora they loathed, the Israeli historian Tom Segev writes in the 7th Million, Israeli leaders radiated arrogance and contempt towards the Holocaust's victims and survivors. Ben-Gurion, like other Israeli leaders at the time, initially saw Shoah survivors as, quote, human debris, claiming that they had survived only because they had been harsh, evil, egotistic. He did not regard them as fit human material for the urgent task of building a strong Jewish state. Right? And there's several quotations like that throughout this book. And this is, I think, the kind of thing that people do not generally talk about. So when I talk about the insights that are to be drawn, and uh, and I want to give you the page citations so that you can go and check these citations, these quotes. If you should pick up this book published by Penguin in the United States and the UK in 2025, and published in India in 2025 by Juggernaut, right? So page 246. So here he's citing Gita Sereni, again, another well-known writer, who Into That Darkness, that's the title of her book, quotes a Czech Jew who helped expedite the killing of fellow Jews. Quote, the Eastern Polish Jews, they were people from a different world. This Czech Jew says they were filthy. They knew nothing. It was impossible to feel any compassion, any solidarity with them. Sereni writes that the Nazis cunningly manipulated the exalted self-image of many Western European Jews who found it almost easier to identify with the Germans, whose way of life had been so like their own. End quote. This is the note on page 246. And this is, of course, a vital point, because there are 2 points here. One has to do with the fact that there was obviously a hierarchy of Jews. Let us put it this way. And the Jews who survived the Shoah, you might think that, well, they were welcomed with open arms by Jews now living in Palestine. Okay? No. They may have been welcomed because they made it possible for the state of Israel to exist, to have a certain demographic profile and strength. This is the politics of numbers that we're speaking about over here. But they were not welcomed merely because they were Jews who had suffered in the Shoah, right? Who had survived the Shoah. And to survive the Shoah was no mean task. And you would think that all empathy and all compassion would be for them. But that is not the case, right? But the second point related to this is that the German Jews, for example, and those who were closer to the German Jews, like the Czech Jews, comparatively speaking, as opposed to the Polish Jews, or the Austrian Jews, who were comparatively closer, to the German Jews, right? These Jews felt much closer to their oppressors, to the Aryan Germans, to the Nazis, who had killed many of their brethren, their brothers and their sisters and their families and hundreds and thousands of others. But they felt closer to them because in some ways they had been integrated into the culture and they aspired to that culture. Right? They felt they had nothing in common with the Poles and the more lowly Slavic end of the human chain. Right? That is one of the insights that you get. Now, again, it may not be entirely new. For example, we're well aware of the fact that of the history of German Jewish life and the manner in which German Jews felt wholly German. Some of them didn't even feel Jewish, particularly in the late 19th century, when it looked like there was very substantive kind of integration. We know from other works, one of which I'm going to do a talk on because it's an absolutely exquisite book on German Jewish life over a period of 200 years. We know that even in World War One, Ger German Jews fought on behalf of Germany and did so with great degree of pride. Uh, right? So this is an instance of the kind of thing that I think one gets a good sense of from Pankaj Mishra's book. Now he wanders over a lot of territory. There are lots of interesting writers that are invoked, some of them very intimately familiar to me. He invokes Marek Edelman, on whom, if you turn to my blog, vineylal.wordpress.com, I did an obituary of Marek Edelman some years ago, 10, 15 years ago when he passed away. He was the deputy commander of the Auschwitz ghetto uprising. He survived that and survived the war, refused to emigrate, to Israel. And when the persecution of the Palestinians began and continued, he was one of the staunchest critics of the state of Israel. A magnificent man, really. He became a cardiologist. He stayed on in Poland. I've gone to the places associated with Marek Edelman in Poland. And as I said, wrote on him 10, 12 years ago. And he wrote an extraordinary book on the ghetto, on the uprising, where he said that, people have tried to magnify, how many people were involved in this uprising. He said, it wasn't thousands. Okay, let's not magnify it. Let's not imagine that every Jewish person was involved in this. But he describes the nature of what happened. Okay, and says that we undertook this because there was no other road open to us. But fundamentally, Marek Edelman was a person who was committed to truth and nonviolence. Right? So Mishra's book, in that sense, is very ecumenical. There's references to Primo Levi, to James Baldwin, discussion of Hannah Arendt, of the Eichmann trial, which comes up in many books, Karl Jaspers, Gunther Anders. This was Hannah Arendt's first husband. Yehuda Elkanah. Yehuda Elkanah was the provost, I think, in fact, the vice chancellor of the Central European University in Budapest. I had the great good fortune of meeting him and being with him at a conference. I'm going to refer to him momentarily again because he was a very radical thinker. Dorothy Thompson, a journalist. Adorno, of course, Margaret Bourke-White, the photographer, Peter Gay, probably one of the most better-known biographers and writers of Freud, the novelist Günter Grass, Tocqueville, and the list goes on. W.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Aimé Césaire, all of these people are mentioned, they're cited, and he's integrated it all very nicely. There's no question about that, right? Because he's really, in that sense, capacious in the way that he wants to think about the various ways in which we can draw connections between Palestine, the question of slavery, colonialism, racism, why the question of Palestine is paramount, why in some ways it's paradigmatic for our times, all of that. Right? But let's take just a couple of points and then we will terminate our discussion. Part two I mentioned to you is about remembering the Holocaust. Okay? But it's not just about remembering the Holocaust. It's about remembering to remember the Holocaust. That in a manner of speaking, we'd forgotten about the Holocaust. We meaning the world. And of course, I've already pointed out the word here means largely for him Europe and America, okay? And some reference to India because he happens to be from there, so he brings in a little autobiographical element into the narrative. Fact of the matter is that the rest of the world doesn't remember the Holocaust very much even today. And they're not remembering to remember the Holocaust either. There's not much Holocaust education and pedagogy in countries in Asia. There's very little scholarship on that. I've been looking for material for that for a long period of time. And I'm not saying, of course, that it's not mentioned anywhere, but it is still, it was a European affair. Its memory is a European affair, Euro-American affair, and the politics of its memory is a Euro-American affair. Of course, what Israel would like to do more than anything else is to completely universalize it, which is to say that if there is a genocide, if there is a paradigmatic instance of it, if there is a people who have ever suffered, and no one has ever suffered as they have, then we have to think of the Holocaust, the Shoah. What Mishra shows in part 2 is this is a laborious task and there is a politics to it. And let me use that word, the Holocaust. It's not that the Holocaust had to be invented. If there hadn't been one, you'd have to invent it if you're going to have the state of Israel. Right? He's not really saying that. I'm taking his argument a bit further, right? But what he is saying in this part is that let's revisit the history of how it's commemorated, how it's remembered. And then he turns his attention to Germany. And it's really, frankly, in some ways, a nauseating, disgusting story because Germany has now arrogated to itself the task of being the moral guardian of the memory of the Holocaust, even more so than Israel, it seems at times. And if you've been following what's been happening in Germany since October 7, 2023, the number of artists and intellectuals and writers who have been cancelled by Germany because they dared to say something in support of the Palestinians, right? It's the sheer arrogance of Germany. And what, of course, we know is that Germany never really de-Nazified. So 6 million Jews, maybe, yes, that 6 million includes, the Roma as well, perhaps. We're never quite sure whether that's 6 million. Sometimes it seems to be only Jews. Sometimes it seems to be, the Jews and the Roma and homosexuals and those who were considered to be, quote, idiots, mentally deformed, right? That's the German view, all right? But whatever the number, whether it's 6 million or 7 million, inclusive of everybody else, the 6 million Jews who were killed, how many Germans, and I want to call them Germans because they were Germans. They were Nazis, but they were Germans before they were Nazis. Okay? How many Germans were sentenced, convicted for crimes committed against humanity, crimes of war, crimes of murder, right? 6,656. When in fact there were millions who were implicated in these crimes. Millions. Okay? And only 164 of these 6,656 were ever sentenced and convicted for murder. The rest was for many other things, for complicity, for conspiracy, for assistance, right? 164. And this and there's one quotation after another by one various writers over the course of 20, 30 pages, which tells you about how these Nazis were all reabsorbed back into the fabric of German life. And of course, Mishra won't say that. I'll say, beware of Germany. This is a country that carried out this fraudulent exercise, this hoax that we're going to totally repent. Okay? And they gave compensation, of course, to the Jewish people. Many people aren't aware of that. Every Jewish person in the state of Israel was given compensation by the state of Germany for decades. All right? Of course, they never gave any such compensation to the Herero in Southwest Africa, where they first carried out all the policies that they were going to then use subsequently 4 decades later against the Jews. Policies of extermination, methods of extermination, experiments. Right? What to speak of compensation? The Germans never, of course, even apologized. And it couldn't, for exactly the same reason that I was discussing 2 days ago in my talk on Hamid Dabashi's book, that Israel is the West. Okay? Germany is the West. The Jewish people may have been other, but your internal other. They're your internal other. Right? And if the supposition is that they're people who are subhuman, or if you can just animalize them, then how do you render an apology to them? What would it mean to render an apology to them? Right? So in Germany, what Mishra is saying is a place that never really, in a sense, fundamentally, never really atoned for what it did. It came back. It assumed, thanks to the Cold War, thanks to American intervention and support, thanks to America's own anti-Semitism, all of that, okay, it essentially returned to a state of normality. And then, when it became clear that Israel would have to become the West, the principal outpost of the West, okay? So you got the war in 1967, and then the Yom Kippur War. 1967, 1973, you've got wars. Around that time, the idea that now the Arab is, so to speak, the new Jew, the person whom you can vilify. The Muslim is the person you can now vilify. Then you had to resuscitate the Jewish person in a different way. And that is when the ethic, the necessity of remembering to remember the Holocaust starts to become important in Germany. Right? That's what this chapter is about. And that's why you get statements of the sort that you saw very recently in the course of the last 2-3 years, where we heard that the Nazis were actually more decent than Hamas, right? Page 123. He gives you a little quotation about that from these gems are scattered really all over. All right. So I think it's 123, 122, somewhere around there. I think I may have lost the um, uh, lost the exact page, but it's somewhere over there. This is a uh, the chapter where he's discussing Germany from anti-Semitism to philo-Semitism. Oh, here's a passage, page 123. The German health minister Karl Lauterbach approvingly retweeted a video in which an English far-right agitator claims that the Nazis were more decent than Hamas. Watch and listen. A deputy chair of the Christian Democratic Union and education minister for Schleswig-Holstein. Okay, this is a part of Germany. Also retweeted. This is great. Jan Fleischhauer, a former editor at Der Spiegel, wrote. Really great, echoed Veronica Grimm, a member of the German Council of Economic Experts. Yeah, where we are now being told, and one German official after another, senior politicians, professionals are saying the Nazis were more decent than Hamas. Right? What can one expect from a country like Germany? Seriously. Yeah. The second half of this chapter is on the Americanization of the Holocaust. How and when did Holocaust memory start to become in the United States? So you have to think about the role of such films like Schindler's List. You have to think about Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. You have to think about the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which took 20 years to build. It was inaugurated in 1993, but its conception goes back many years. Peter Novak's book, The Holocaust in American Life, published in 1999, I think is still the best book, which gives us a view on that. But it's important. I won't get into it right now. It's important, this segment of the story, because there is a large section of the ferociously anti-Semitic American right, which is now pretending to love the Jews. So that phrase from anti-Semitism to philo-Semitism that he uses for Germany applies very much here. Many of the people who were brought before the House committee, presided over by this Harvard-educated woman, what's her name? Stefanek, something like that. I think she's now going to be leaving Congress, disappointed because she didn't get a cabinet position under Trump. She's a ferocious Trumpite, right? So she was one of the members of this committee, this House committee, that were grilling these university presidents for tolerating anti-Semitism on their campus. Some of you may recall these hearings. They were televised as well. We're speaking about the months of April, May, June 2024, when the protests were taking place on American university campuses, right? And these people are all ferociously anti-Semitic, the bulk of them. And now they are pretending to love the Jewish people. They're displaying this kind of philo-Semitism, right? But there's a long history of the abandonment of these Jews. The turning away from the Jews. America is one of the countries that took the smallest number of Jewish refugees. It took in about 23,000 Jewish refugees during the whole course of the war. Okay? In 3.5 years, that is from the day after Pearl Harbor, when the United States now goes to war, not just against Japan, but against Germany as well, until the surrender of Germany. That's right. We're talking about in those 3.5 years, it was something like 22,000 Jewish people, refugees, were admitted. Tens of thousands were turned away. And David Wyman wrote a book called The Abandonment of the Jews, which I remember from the time that it was published, sometime around 1984, something like that. I remember acquiring a copy of that book shortly thereafter. Um, and he mentions about how there were Jews after the war who were in limbo. And they were actually put in camps, not concentration camps, a new series of camps for displaced Jewish people. All right, no European country really wanted them. The United States did not want them. Yeah, and yet decades later, we come to Philo-Semitism. So what he's doing in the chapter is he's not giving you a systematic scholarly history of that. He's giving you some of the nuggets around this. And what he does in the last portion of the book is to look at the intertwined histories of the Holocaust, of slavery, of racism, colonialism. Because here again, like many others, he's animated by the question, how do we think through the question of Palestine? What will make possible a free Palestine? David Ben-Gurion was firmly of the view that the liberation of Palestine is not possible without the destruction of the state of Israel. Now, so if you agree with that premise, then you can either have Palestine or you can have the state of Israel, right? How do we think through this? And it's not so much the destruction of the state of Israel. It's a question of who are the Jewish people? Wherein lie their gifts? What is their history? How is it that the Jewish people in such dire conditions were able to create such an extraordinary culture, such a rich intellectual life, notwithstanding their relatively small numbers? Every place they went to, where they were, they made a contribution to the life of that nation. And what the book invites us to do, I wish he had been able to really make a full-fledged kind of exploration of that. It would perhaps require a different book, because then you would have to really get into the whole question of the relationship between Jewish history and the diaspora. Is it the case that the Jewish people will really only flourish in a diasporic condition? Right? And yet again, then we have to think about it, and this is where I would invite those who are listening only to this talk and haven't listened to my talk on the Hamid Dabashi book, that we have to maybe listen to that, because, we may be at risk of trying to fetishize the idea of exile in some ways, that the Jewish person only flourishes in exile. But what does it mean to be in exile? And what are the various ways in which one becomes an exile to one's own culture as well? Shouldn't the thinking American, whatever the race and gender of the thinking American, have to really go into exile as a state of mind? That is, you depart, you sign off from the dominant reigning ethos of the time. which is now authoritarianism in this country as well, in the United States. Right? So there are many ways to think about it. These are not simple questions. And perhaps I think one comes away with reading Pankaj Mishra's book with more questions. Thank you.